Hello and welcome to another edition of Life Skills on GNAT TV. I'm Andrew McKeever. It's my pleasure to be your host for our show today. Today is Friday, November 17th, and today we're going to continue with our exploration of topics about what you might call problems of life. And today the topic we're going to look at is personal finance, or more precisely, keeping track of personal finance. Our timing is excellent. As many of you may know, yesterday, on Thursday, November 16th, Governor Phil Scott and the State Treasurer Beth Pearce announced the formation of a workshop on financial literacy for Vermonters. So I think we're right there along with the curve here. So it'll be a good time for us to kind of brush up on some old skills like keeping track of the old-fashioned checkbook here, and learning about a few other details that pertain to credit cards, and perhaps also keeping your personal financial data secure. With us today to talk about these and perhaps a few other subjects are two experts on personal finance, so I guess it's fair to say. Al Clausen is the branch manager of Berkshire Bank's Richville Road branch, and next to him is Jeremy Case, who is the assistant branch manager there at Richville Road. Gentlemen, welcome to GNAT, and thank you for making the time available to talk with us today.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Well, like I said, let's start off then kind of with the basics. The old humble checkbook that many of us of a certain age remember with, I guess, fondness might be one way. Pretty simple kind of thing one would think to keep track of a checkbook. You know, you enter your income, your assets, you know, the monthly or weekly paycheck, whatever it is. You keep track of all the bills that you pay, writing them out on that little piece of paper there. And at the end of the week or the month, hopefully more has gone in than has been taken out. That would seem straightforward enough, Jeremy, but apparently a lot of people struggle with this. And I guess, is there some secret to this that we none of us have known about for a long time, or what?
Well, that's true. A lot of people do struggle with it. It's one of those things that's mystified everyone for all of time, it seems. But I think as things change and evolve, so do the practices in maintaining such a thing. But still, the old standard is true, as you mentioned. You know, putting in your assets or your deposits as they come in, and also to check off things. I personally, with a checkbook register, like to use a highlighter to highlight things as they come through. If you have access to online banking and can check your transactions as they come through, you can do it daily. Sometimes people prefer to check their balance weekly, either with a telephone, you know, by phoning into the bank through an automated telephone service, or by stopping into the branch to talk about it with a bank teller. At any rate, each month a statement is cut, as you may know, and generally what will happen is you can reconcile from the statement to the checkbook as things come through. Again, I like to use a highlighter personally. Some people like to use a check mark or certain colored pens, but effectively just making sure that everything you pay out of your checkbook, writing checks, doing transactions with a debit card or withdrawals from an ATM, and payments that go in are logged as soon as possible. I think that oftentimes the mistakes or errors that happen just are, you know, a common oversight of adding something into the checkbook. I even personally almost always have my statement at the end of the month and find that there's at least one thing that I neglected to put in because I was running out of the grocery store or out of the ATM in the rain. You know, as long as you reconcile those things each month, you should be pretty close.
So the old bank statement at the end of the month still comes in handy then with making sure that, you know, everyone's on the same page.
Yes. Yes, it does. It's also very important to reconcile to your bank statement because, as we were talking about the data security, and I'm sure we'll get into in a little bit, if there are charges that are mistakenly placed in your account or you know, fraudulent activity perhaps, or, you know, just any interest payments, things like that, maybe things that you may not necessarily add into your checkbook on a daily basis, you'll see in the statement as well. And if not looked at, you may never even realize is coming in or going out.
One of the things that in the past used to trip me up an awful lot were bank fees.
Yes.
I forget to enter those $10 or $15 or $20 fees that would come in, and for some reason that would throw things off a little bit.
Yes.
usually fairly easy to reconcile that at the end. Al, I guess one of you were saying before we went on air that one of the ways people might be able to kind of minimize their chances of getting their checkbook a little bit out of whack is to have a monthly budget or weekly budget or whatever.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So an extension of the checkbook would definitely be a budget. It could be a simple spreadsheet that you create yourself, or there's plenty of software options out there that you can use. But I would definitely recommend using a budget. And then it helps you not with only just planning your weekly or monthly things, but planning out things that could happen a quarter from now or next year. I want to buy a house, I want to buy a car. It'll help you look at what you spent and what you've brought in for income and reconcile the difference of those two. How much did I save at the end of the month? And now I need to project ahead and look to see how much do I need to save for those items that either I want to spend or taxes that are coming down the road that are paid quarterly, or so you just kind of help you plan ahead with the budget, and highly recommend that. It's kind of the foundation for all financial planning. Is if you have that budget in place, you will be able to know if and when you'll be able to make that purchase of a car or house or whatever else you plan on.
That's one skill that I definitely need to learn more about, for sure. I was thinking though, as I was the past couple of weeks as we've been pulling the show together, that it would seem like it's with the online banking that's now available. It wasn't the case 10, 15, 20 or so years ago, at least to the level it is now. It should be fairly, I would think, a lot easier to keep track of some of all these expenditures. Particularly, I guess, because we also have phone apps that can go right on your phone, and you can simply keep track of everything literally on the fly.
Yes, that has been a trend in banking and checkbook reconciliation in years present, is the advent of the internet, of course, and being able to securely check your statements and your transactions on a real-time basis. As we were just talking about with the checks, as we all know, the checks take time to clear, and it is one of those things that may not necessarily be reflected in your checking account balance immediately after you write a check. However, with most debit card transactions and ATM card transactions, the transaction is displayed in your account immediately, and so it's an exciting time for for banking to be able to access all of those records in real time as they happen, especially as you mentioned with a mobile app that can be placed on a telephone to easily access a more condensed version of the online banking that most banks offer. You can literally see a transaction coming through your account immediately after you've swiped your card. Of course, there are two ways to look at that, because the checkbook register now becomes a little bit harder to reconcile, because as more debit card transactions happen, as opposed to having cash and writing checks as the financial model for people, many more debit card transactions take place, and it's a lot harder to keep track of in the checkbook register. So for that reason, the mobile app becomes extremely handy to be able to keep a running balance in your checking account.
I imagine this must be also a bit of a generational thing too. I imagine most of your customers, let's say under the age of 40, probably think running a phone app is like, well, yeah, duh, of course you would do that. But then there are people like me,
Yeah.
and since there are a lot of people like me who live in the state, and our old and aging population, probably they haven't quite gotten comfortable with the idea of a phone app, I would think. Or have they?
True. We are one of the oldest states, and certainly in our area, Manchester, we have an elder generation, and certainly they do kind of latch on to the checkbook. Now, my 19-year-old son, he probably wouldn't even know what that is. So
Times change. Well, that brings up that question then we were talking about earlier about data security. I mean, to me anyway, with the idea of running a lot of your finances through a phone. We had the House Commerce Committee down here in Manchester earlier this week for a hearing about data security and a piece of legislation they may well want to write sometime when they reconvene in Montpelier next January. And there's a lot of talk about data security, the Equifax breach that occurred last August, I believe, where some 145 million Americans had their personal information compromised in one way or another, social security numbers, phone numbers, addresses, even driver's license information. I mean, it was pretty wild. And 240,000 of those were from Vermont. That's more than a third of the state's population. So that certainly gives one pause for like thinking, okay, you know, just because I'm entering the stuff on my phone and keeping track of it that way, that it's, you know, everything's going to be fine and dandy. One thing that struck me about what was suggested as the best way to kind of make sure that you know, your credit would be safe, or at least not tinkered with without your knowing about, would be to have a freeze put on your credit report. And I guess that's a two-part question now. Like, first of all, tell us, what is a credit report? And then, do you think that's a practical solution? Because it sounded like that was a rather cumbersome solution that would really kind of tie up, you know, your finances much more so than you would like them to be.
Mm-hmm. All right, so the first part, credit report is a kind of a sum total of your finances. How are you in terms of debt to income? What do you have for outstanding credit cards, balances? It's a huge sum of things, and it generally, I think it ranges between 300 and 850 for a credit score. The better you do with all these things, with your finances, with your checkbook, with your budgeting, planning, et cetera, will build your score up closer to that 850. Second part of that, yes. So if you want to protect yourself, one thing you can do is to do that freeze. Now, it's an inconvenience because once you do the freeze, that means, if, as you pointed out earlier, if you want to purchase a car, well, then you would have to unfreeze, make the purchase of the car, and then refreeze after that. So, yes, it's a protection, but it can be cumbersome.
So is there any other way to kind of, you know, other than really being smart about, you know, passwords and kind of sophisticated on that and keeping track of things, that the average consumer can be, you know, sleep well at night knowing that their financial data is safe?
Well, yeah, we were talking earlier also about passwords and PINs. A lot of people set up passwords and PINs that are fairly easy to break for the hackers, using personal names, date of birth, etc. All very simple things for a hacker to just break. So definitely want to create a password that would be a little more difficult. Same with PINs. You know, you certainly don't want to have a PIN on your debit card that's 1111. Maybe make it a little more complicated. Not your birth date.
Right.
So there are definitely some common sense things that you can use, which may be more difficult for you as a consumer to remember those passwords or those PINs, but you certainly don't want to make it too easy for the hackers.
Well, yeah, it's a whole level of financial interaction that, you know, boy, I tell you, was quite an eye-opener for me anyway. Just before we leave this part of it, can people can keep track of all their accounts online, right? At this point, I mean, you
Generally,
can,
yes.
you can go onto the bank's website or whatever, and you see all the accounts you might have, whether it's a checking account or other accounts that you may have, and it's all in one place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And generally, also to add to that, there's and to add to what Al just said about the passwords and PINs and protecting your financial data, a big portion of it, I believe, is effective monitoring, which can happen as part of an online banking experience too. There are products that many banks offer that will monitor your credit for you. There are also alerts that you can set up through an online banking system that will alert you to different parameters of use of your checking account. For example, things like when a purchase is made, or if a balance reaches a certain amount, or if there's a deposit made. Those things are things that can be set up as bank alerts to be sent to you via a text message or an email to alert you to activity within your checking account as well.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
Well, that'd be good. Well, and that reminds me, beyond the checking account, again, back in the day, we used to have these things called savings accounts.
Yes.
You try to throw in a certain amount of money each week or month or whatever. But a savings account seems to have gone the way of, you take your pick from the 70s or 80s. So if someone did want to try and, like, say, save 10% of their salary or weekly paycheck or whatever it is to, to buy that car or the house or whatever, or maybe even just save for retirement, how would they do that nowadays? Is it mainly a certificate of deposit? Is that the main vehicle that folks will use, or is there something else they could tinker with?
Yeah, there's a wide range of things you can do. I mean, savings account would be the least interest, money market, a little more, and CD. And then, you would have investments as well. It kind of depends on your age and your risk appetite. If you're a little more if you're willing to take a risk, you can invest in the stock market, bonds, anything like that. And then you can invest in 401k through your job. So plenty of investment vehicles that you can use. And then back to the purchase, it kind of depends on when do you want to make that purchase. If you're thinking about making that within the next 2 or 3 years, if you wanted to put it in a 2-year CD or something like that, okay, you lock it up for 2 years, get a decent rate, and then you can make that purchase 2 years from now.
What would be considered a decent rate nowadays? 3-4%, something like that, or what would be?
Andrew, not quite the rates that we remember back from the.
I mean, yeah, I'm
no
thinking
more 50%
double-digit
CDs.
Yeah, right, the good old days, so to speak. But I mean, inflation is now what seems to be bouncing between 1% and 2% most of the time. I mean,
Correct.
Would you be able to get something at least a little bit higher than that, so you're not just offsetting inflation?
We're kind of hovering around inflation right now. We have a range of CD rates that anywhere from 3 months to 5 years. So. Again, obviously, the longer the term, the longer the interest, or the higher the interest you would bear with that.
Okay, well, let's pivot then to the credit card piece of this. A subject I'm sure of great interest to a lot of our viewers because we all use them. It seems like anyway, and use them a lot more than I remember, using them in the past. So I guess the big question with credit cards is. You get this line of credit with the credit card, whether it's $5,000 or $10,000 or $20,000, and then you swipe it here, you swipe it there, and how important is it? I mean, I know in theory it would be great to pay it off completely every month. I imagine most people, or a lot of people, aren't able to do that, and they run balances. But is there some kind of golden rule or rule of thumb about how much you should have out there on your credit card that's manageable, or is there some point where you really get to have a sort of like a structural debt that you almost can never pay off? Is there some point where, like, is it like at the 50% mark? Let's say for that $10,000 line of credit, would you say if you get to $5,000, you really got to, like, slam the brakes on at that point, or is that number lower or higher?
I would honestly say it would be well below that 50% point, truly. If we're talking about, getting to a point where you have manageable debt, I would say more like 35 to 40% utilization would be, ideal if you are to carry a balance. I feel the best way to use a credit card is to, make those purchases and then try to pay them off immediately. In that way, you end up essentially paying zero interest on most credit cards because you have a certain grace period to pay them back, typically within a statement cycle. But if you have to carry a balance, it's not necessarily so detrimental to your credit score because as the credit agencies work, they tend to look at things like a 30% utilization as not necessarily a bad thing. However, it is one of those things that does have to be managed, and as we go back to the humble checkbook, one adage of days past would be if you can't afford it, don't buy it. And so you do kind of have to take a little bit of that into effect still in this day and age with credit. It's a very powerful thing, and will ultimately, if used wisely, affect the interest rate and the credit score and many financial benefits by having and using credit cards. But as you point out, it is one of those things that to keep it manageable, you want to keep that under that 50% mark.
So if you're consistently running a credit balance that's north of 35, 40%, does that affects your credit score? It knocks you down from that 850 point where, which I guess is considered a good place to be?
It absolutely could. And another thing is, if you're running a balance, definitely always make a payment for that month. If you're late on a payment, that's another huge thing on the credit score, is if you're running late payments, that will affect you as well, negatively.
What nowadays is considered to be like a sort of a good interest rate on a credit card? I mean, I get solicitations in the mail all the time from all kinds of banks, ranging anywhere from, it seems like, around 10% to about 20%, roughly seems to be the band.
Yeah, that seems to be it kind of cycles itself within your credit score. It's one of those things where you need credit to have credit. And what I mean by that is if you have a credit score that is higher, you will ultimately get a lower interest rate on the credit that you have. Credit cards typically, the credit card companies will typically base they'll offer a promotional period where you get a special interest rate to kind of entice you to get the card and to use it. But once that is over, usually 6 to 12 months after you get the credit card, the interest rate, APR, or annual percentage yield, kicks in. And that can typically be anywhere from 9.99% currently, typically, it kind of hovers the low end around there, up to as much as 24%. And what dictates that is your credit score. So when you apply for the credit card, if your credit score is, say, a 720, you might be in the middle of that range. If your credit score is lower, typically you'll be in the higher end of that range. And if you have a fantastic, or what we call a super credit score of 800, you would typically get that lowest interest rate. So as you use those credit cards responsibly, your credit score improves, and then your credit interest rate will hopefully improve as well.
So is the way out of a bad credit card situation, let's say you've run up a whole bunch of bills, you're close to maxing out that card, seems like the golden parachute then is to like simply transfer that to another credit card and kind of that has like maybe a better interest rate or is a higher interest rate, so you can go on borrowing, I guess, more money. But there's a bit of I guess there's one factor you need to consider with that, and that's there's a transfer fee that goes with that. Is there not? I mean,
Typically,
and sometimes
yes.
that even though it might seem like tempting because you have a lower interest rate on this new card that you want to transfer your money into, and you think, oh, okay, so that's going to like modify my interest payments, that transfer payment might kind of wipe out that advantage. Is that accurate to say, or is that?
I'm sure 2 to 4%, I believe, is usually the transfer fee.
Okay.
Rate. So
it's just something to factor into the whole general equation then, just to.
Yeah, and again, when
do the
used
numbers.
Responsibly, the balance transfer option can be a great way to pay off more quickly the credit card debt that you have already, because you're not. Part of that payment isn't interest. It goes completely to principal during that promotional period where you're paying off those balance transfers. I think the pitfall that sometimes people get into is to just carry and transfer a balance and just carry that same debt load from one place to another until eventually it gets to a point where it becomes very difficult to manage and pay off. Like I said, when used responsibly, transferring those balances can be a great way to pay them down much faster. But it takes discipline, because the best way to do it ultimately is to pay more than the principal and interest that is due. Really, that's the way to get ahead of falling into too much debt, is to never make the minimum payment if possible.
I think it all comes back full circle to what we started off with, your checkbook, looking at online banking, making sure that you are making proper decisions, you're not getting ahead of yourself, you have a certain amount of income coming in, don't overextend yourself. Plan ahead to things that you need to purchase in the future, and if you do all of those things, then you won't end up with a maxed out credit card.
Right.
Or a credit score in the low 300s or whatever.
Yeah, and I'll just point out, as far as the budget goes too, it's an amazing thing, as Al mentioned, to be able to actually put out a budget in front of you and to be able to look at it on paper. It's easy to kind of think of all the things that you're spending, and you know that you're at least breaking even or maybe doing a little better than that by the end of the month. But to actually look at it on a weekly, on a daily, on a monthly, on a yearly basis to see where you can cut those costs is very eye-opening and can be very encouraging too. I mean, to give you an example, if the average person working a 40-hour job maybe will buy lunch once in a while. Hopefully not buying lunch every day because that's one of those costs that can be cut. My point is, a fast food lunch and a coffee can be as much as $10. If someone, for example, is doing that each day of the week and cuts that back for one a week and does 4 instead of 5, that's over a $500 savings per year. So while it seems small in the moment, when looking at it on paper over time, there can be a huge savings there if you just have a budget and plan for it.
All right, well, those are good words, and makes me think, boy, I should get that spreadsheet out. Keeping track of
We'll help you.
all those little, yeah, right, I'll come in and you guys can set me all up. Well, anyway, gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us today. This has been really interesting to hear. I really appreciate your time, and want to thank all of you for joining us as well. This has been Life Skills on GNET TV. Pleasure to have you with us today, and stay tuned for our next edition, which will be coming along next month. Thank you very much, and have a great day.